The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Cook County Courthouse in downtown Chicago, casting long shadows across the marble floors. 9-year-old Emma Richardson sat rigidly in the hard wooden chair outside courtroom 7B, her small fingers intertwined with the soft golden fur of her beloved golden retriever, Max. The dog seemed to sense her anxiety, pressing his warm body closer to her leg in a gesture of unconditional comfort. Emma's mother, Susan Richardson, sat beside her daughter, her hand trembling slightly as she checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes. Inside that courtroom, justice would finally be served, or so they hoped. 3 years. It had been exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days since Emma's mother, Sarah Mitchell, had vanished without a trace from their suburban home in Evanston. Emma remembered that night vividly, though the trauma had fragmented her memories into disjointed, haunting pieces. She was only 6 years old then, and Max had been just a puppy, barely a year old. The details remained etched in her mind like scars that refused to heal. The sudden banging on the door, her mother's panicked voice, the sound of a car engine revving aggressively outside, and then nothing. Silence. An absence so profound that it had consumed their entire family. The police investigation had been thorough but ultimately frustrating. Detective James, no relation to judge who would preside over today's trial, had worked the case relentlessly for months. Leads evaporated like morning dew. Witnesses came forward with conflicting stories. Security cameras had malfunctioned that very night, a convenient coincidence that had later proven suspicious. For nearly 2 years, the case had gone cold, gathering dust in filing cabinets while Emma and her remaining family members struggled with the unbearable weight of not knowing. Then, last year, a breakthrough came. A surveillance camera from a neighboring street had captured footage of a vehicle matching witness descriptions. The license plate was partially visible, and through painstaking detective work, authorities had traced it to Thomas, a man with a criminal history of abduction and assault. He'd managed to evade conviction in 2 previous cases through clever legal maneuvering and expensive lawyers. The evidence against him was circumstantial but compelling. A rental car matching the description, a storage unit rented under an assumed name, and most recently, Sarah's personal belongings discovered hidden in that unit. But the physical evidence alone might not be enough to convict him. The case needed something more, testimony that could break through reasonable doubt. Emma had been prepared for this moment by her therapist, Doctor, who specialized in trauma recovery for children. Over the past 6 months, Emma had extensive psychological evaluation and preparation. She'd been deemed competent to testify, though there were concerns about the reliability of her memories and the emotional toll this would take. Doctor had worked with Emma to help her separate her fragmented recollections from her emotional responses, to strengthen her ability to articulate what she did remember, however incomplete it might be. But there was something else, something that Doctor and Emma's family knew about but hadn't fully disclosed to the court. For the past 2 years, Emma had been working with Max in ways that transcended typical pet companionship. After her mother's disappearance, Emma had become almost obsessively attached to the dog. She spent hours with him, talking to him, confiding in him, teaching him. Doctor had noted that this bond was therapeutic and had encouraged it, seeing it as a healthy outlet for Emma's trauma. But what had developed was far more extraordinary than anyone had anticipated. Max had become Emma's emotional anchor, her protector, and somehow, in ways that still everyone involved, her partner in processing trauma. Emma had begun developing a language with Max, specific whispers, hand signals, and behavioral cues that created a communication system unique to the two of them. It wasn't formal dog training in the traditional sense, though Emma's father had taught Max basic commands. This was something more intuitive, more primal. Emma whispered to Max about the night her mother disappeared, describing the man's voice, his scent details she couldn't quite articulate to adults but could somehow express to the dog. And Max, with the remarkable emotional intelligence that certain dogs possess, seemed to understand and respond. Judge, who would preside over Thomas's trial, had made an extraordinary decision. After reviewing doctors' recommendations and Emma's file, he had agreed to allow Max to sit with Emma during her testimony. This was highly unusual, bordering on precedent-setting. The defense attorney, a slick Chicago lawyer named Robert, had objected vehemently. He argued that the presence of the dog would be prejudicial, that it would unfairly manipulate the jury's emotions, that it had no place in a court of law. But Judge had held firm, noting that the emotional support animal could remain in the courtroom as long as it remained calm and did not disrupt proceedings. Thomas sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit failing to conceal the hardness in his features. He was a man in his late 40s with cold gray eyes that had stared down 2 previous victims with impunity. His lawyer had coached him well. He appeared confident, almost casual, as if he had nothing to worry about. He'd beaten charges before. He would beat them again. The system was flawed, manipulable, and he'd learned to navigate its complexities. His presence in the courtroom was a challenge to justice itself, a manifestation of the terrifying reality that evil sometimes walks free. Emma's heart pounded as the court clerk began calling the case to order. Her Aunt Rachel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She'd been living with her aunt and uncle for the past 3 years, her father having relocated to Colorado for work, unable to bear the constant reminders of Sarah's absence. Aunt Rachel had been everything to Emma during those dark years: a surrogate mother, a protector, a beacon of stability in an unstable world. As they entered courtroom 7B, the air felt thick with significance. The gallery was packed with journalists, family members, and concerned citizens who'd followed this case. Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had captured public attention, a beautiful young woman vanishing without explanation, leaving behind a traumatized child and a community desperate for answers. Now, finally, there would be testimony. Finally, justice might have a chance. Judge sat elevated above the courtroom, his silver hair and measured demeanor commanding respect. He studied Emma and Max with evident interest and curiosity, his expression unreadable. Emma took her place at the witness stand, Max positioned carefully beside the judge's bench. She placed her small hand on a Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, words that felt impossibly heavy for a 9-year-old to carry. As the first questions began, Emma felt Max's presence beside her like an anchor holding her steady in a storm. She didn't know yet that this dog would help her do something extraordinary, something that would revolutionize how justice was served in this very courtroom. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres, stood deliberately slowly, allowing the courtroom to settle into silence. He was a man in his 50s with a reputation for meticulous preparation and an unwavering commitment to justice. Torres had spent the past 6 weeks preparing for this moment, interviewing Emma multiple times, reviewing every piece of evidence, and building a narrative that would connect the fragmented testimony of a traumatized child to the concrete evidence authorities had assembled against Thomas. He approached the witness stand with measured steps, his expression warm but professional, designed to put Emma at ease while simultaneously establishing his authority. "Emma," he began, his voice gentle yet steady, "I know this is difficult for you. I want you to know that you're very brave for being here today. Is that okay if I ask you some questions?" Emma nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. She could see Max from the corner of her eye, his golden form providing an invisible thread of comfort across the courtroom. Her throat felt dry, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She'd practiced these answers with Doctor dozens of times, but nothing could truly prepare her for the reality of sitting in this imposing courtroom, surrounded by strangers, speaking about the worst night of her life. "Emma, can you tell the court what you remember about the evening of March 14th, 3 years ago?" Torres asked, consulting his notes with deliberate care. Emma took a shaky breath. "It was nighttime. I remember it was dark outside. Mommy was making dinner spaghetti, I think. She was singing and it made me happy." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and the court reporter leaned forward slightly to ensure they captured every word. "And what happened next?" Torres prompted gently. "There was a knock on the door. It was really loud, like someone was hitting it hard." Emma's hands trembled slightly. Mommy went to see who it was. She looked through the window thing, the peephole, and her face changed. She looked scared. Judge observed Emma intently, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He'd presided over hundreds of cases, but something about this young girl's testimony resonated with an unusual urgency. Her recollection was genuine, uncalculated, the testimony of a child still bearing the wounds of trauma. "Did she open the door?" Torres asked. "No, she told me to go to my room and take Max with me. She said it in a voice I'd never heard before, not her normal voice. It was scared." Emma's eyes grew distant, as if she were reliving that moment. "I went upstairs with Max. He was just a little dog then, not as big as he is now. I remember he was confused because it was early. We usually didn't go to bed that early." The defense attorney, Robert, sat casually in his chair, his expression suggesting mild disinterest. He was a master of psychological manipulation, understanding that juries responded to confidence as much as to evidence. His strategy would be to undermine Emma's credibility, to suggest that her traumatized memory had fabricated details, that a 6-year-old's recollection couldn't possibly be reliable testimony. But first he would let her speak, let her establish her narrative, then systematically dismantle it. Torres continued methodically. "What happened after you went to your room?" "I heard voices getting louder. A man's voice, really angry, and Mommy was saying no, no, no. Max started barking. I was scared, so I picked him up and held him tight. He was shaking too." Tears began forming in Emma's eyes, though she fought to maintain her composure. "I heard something crash, like something falling. Then Mommy screamed. It was the scariest sound I've ever heard." Several members of the gallery visibly reacted, one woman clutching her hand to her mouth, another wiping away tears. Thomas, however, remained unmoved, his expression blank, almost contemptuous. He'd worn that same expression 3 years ago when he'd taken Sarah Mitchell, and he wore it now as if he existed beyond the reach of conventional morality. "Did you go downstairs?" Torres asked. "No, I was too scared. I stayed in my room with Max. I heard things moving, crashing, and then—" Emma paused, her voice becoming almost inaudible. "Then I heard a car outside, the sound of an engine starting. It was really loud, like the person was driving really fast, and then it was quiet. Everything was just quiet." Torres allowed the silence to extend for several moments, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. This was a crucial moment, establishing the timeline, the nature of the abduction, the terror that had gripped Sarah Mitchell in those final moments before her disappearance. "Emma, did you go downstairs after you heard the car leave?" "I don't remember," Emma said honestly, and Torres appreciated her truthfulness. A fabricated memory would have been more complete, more detailed. The fact that she acknowledged gaps in her recollection actually enhanced her credibility. "I remember being really scared and holding Max. I think I might have fallen asleep. When I woke up, Aunt Rachel was there and police officers." Torres nodded. "Thank you, Emma. I know that was hard." He paused, then asked the crucial question. "Emma, during that night, did you see the man who came to your house?" "I saw his shoes," Emma replied quietly. "At the top of the stairs. They were big black shoes, and I remember his voice. He was very angry and mean." "And can you see that man in this courtroom today?" Emma's eyes slowly traveled across the courtroom, and they landed on Thomas. For a moment, their eyes locked, and something primal seemed to pass between them. Thomas's confident smirk faltered almost imperceptibly. Emma pointed directly at him, her small finger steady despite her internal turmoil. "That's him, that's his voice. I remember it." Judge made a note, his expression thoughtful. This identification was important but circumstantial, a child identifying a voice she'd heard in terror 3 years ago. Any competent defense attorney could argue that trauma had distorted her memory, that she was simply identifying the defendant she'd been prepared to identify. Torres continued with additional questions, establishing details about the house, the sequence of events, and Emma's emotional state. Her answers were consistent, her memory reliable where it existed and honest where it didn't. After 40 minutes of direct examination, Torres concluded with "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge glanced at the defense table. "Mister, do you wish to cross-examine?" Stood smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket with theatrical precision. "I do, Your Honor." He approached the witness stand with a predatory grace, his smile calculated to seem friendly while his eyes revealed something far colder. This was his moment to dismantle the prosecution's case, to suggest that a traumatized child's testimony was unreliable, contaminated by suggestion and the passage of 3 years. "Emma," he began, his tone dripping with false warmth, "you were very young when this happened, weren't you? Only 6 years old." "Yes," Emma replied, gripping Max's presence in her mind like a lifeline. And thus began the most challenging part of her ordeal, the cross-examination that would push her recollections, challenge her memory, and attempt to paint her as an unreliable witness. As questions intensified, Emma's hand unconsciously moved toward the invisible connection she shared with Max, that secret language developing between them that nobody else fully understood or appreciated. Yet, Robert's cross-examination had been methodical and relentless for the past hour. He'd questioned every detail of Emma's recollection, suggesting that trauma had distorted her memories, that she'd been influenced by leading questions from law enforcement, that a 6-year-old's perception couldn't possibly be trusted to identify anyone with certainty. He'd walked her through the timeline repeatedly, catching her in minor inconsistencies. She'd said the man's shoes were black, but then later mentioned they might have been dark brown. She'd said she heard the car drive away fast, but perhaps she'd imagined that detail, incorporating it from conversations she'd overheard. Emma's responses had become increasingly hesitant as chipped away at her confidence. Judge observed with growing concern, recognizing the tactics of a defense attorney who knew his client was guilty, and therefore had to destroy the credibility of the only witness who could place him at the scene. The judge had presided over enough trials to understand that this was standard procedure, but it remained deeply troubling to watch a child being psychologically dismantled in the pursuit of reasonable doubt. "Emma," continued, packing before the witness stand like a predator circling prey, "isn't it true that you've discussed this night with many different people over the past 3 years? Police officers, detectives, your therapist, your aunt, your uncle, social workers?" "Yes," Emma admitted quietly. "And each time you told the story, your memory was reinforced by their reactions, wasn't it? They encouraged you to remember details. They asked leading questions. They showed you photographs and asked you to identify people. Isn't that right?" "They were trying to help me," Emma said, her voice barely steady. "Of course they were," agreed smoothly, his tone suggesting sympathy while his eyes remained cold. "But the problem with memory, especially in traumatized children, is that it becomes contaminated. It becomes influenced. It becomes unreliable. You can't actually be certain you've correctly identified my client, can you? You were 6 years old in the dark, terrified. You heard a voice. That's all you truly know." Emma's hands began to shake. She could feel tears forming again, threatening to spill over. This was precisely why Doctor had warned her this would be difficult. The defense attorney's job was to create doubt, and he was extraordinarily skilled at it. Emma glanced toward Max, and what happened next would alter the entire trajectory of the trial. As if sensing her distress through some invisible, incomprehensible channel that existed between them alone, Max began to shift restlessly. Emma's breathing became rapid, her anxiety spiking. She needed comfort. She needed her anchor. She needed Max to understand her, to know what she was feeling, what she'd endured, what she needed to communicate to this courtroom. Emma leaned slightly forward, her small hand moving in a gesture that appeared almost invisible to observers, a gentle motion near her face, combined with a barely audible whisper. It was the signal she and Max had developed over nearly 2 years of their unique bonding. It was her way of communicating with the dog when words felt insufficient, when emotions ran too deep for conventional language. The whisper was so faint that even the court reporter couldn't capture it clearly on the transcript. It sounded like "Max, remember," though it was more complicated than that. A series of tones and inflections that carried meaning only the girl and her dog understood. It was accompanied by a specific hand signal, 2 fingers extended downward in a subtle gesture that had developed its own significance in their private language. What happened next froze the entire courtroom in shocked silence. Max suddenly stood, his entire demeanor transforming. The gentle, obedient golden retriever that had been lying peacefully beside the judge's bench became something entirely different. His ears flattened against his head, his golden fur seeming to bristle along his spine. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing his teeth, and a low, menacing growl emanated from his throat, a sound so primal and saturated with protective fury that it sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. The dog's behavior was absolutely unprecedented and utterly undeniable. Max began moving toward the defendant's table with deliberate, measured steps, his entire body language conveying an almost supernatural level of recognition and threat. Thomas's face drained of color, his confident composure shattered like glass. He pushed backward in his chair, instinctively recoiling from the approaching animal. The bailiff moved forward uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene. "Control your dog," shouted, his smooth demeanor evaporating instantly. But Emma merely made another subtle gesture, and Max circled Thomas once, then twice, his growl never ceasing, his eyes locked onto the defendant's face with an intensity that transcended normal animal behavior. It was as if the dog could see into Thomas's soul, could recognize the evil that resided there, could perceive the truth of what this man had done. Then Emma whispered once more, a different inflection, a different tone. Max barked sharply once, a singular sound that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Immediately, the dog returned to Emma's side, sitting down precisely where he'd been positioned before, his body still radiating protective intensity, his eyes never leaving Thomas. The entire sequence had lasted perhaps 45 seconds, but it had fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the courtroom. Judge stood abruptly, his gavel momentarily suspended in midair. His expression transformed from judicial neutrality to something approaching profound realization. He'd studied animal behavior extensively as a personal interest, not as a lawyer, but as a deeply curious individual who'd read numerous books on canine cognition and behavioral science. He understood what he'd just witnessed. Dogs possessed an extraordinary ability to sense danger, to recognize threats, to identify individuals through scent and voice recognition capabilities far exceeding human capacity. More significantly, this particular dog's behavior had been deliberate, trained, intentional. Emma's hand signals and whispered commands indicated a sophisticated communication system between child and animal. The dog wasn't merely reacting emotionally. It was responding to specific commands that had been developed and refined over months or years. Thomas's reaction was equally illuminating. Innocent people didn't recoil in terror when a dog approached them. Innocent people didn't turn pale and attempt to flee. Innocent people didn't display the visceral panic that had just seized Thomas's entire body. The gallery erupted in murmurs and gasps. Journalists scribbled frantically in their notepads. Several jurors exchanged meaningful glances. One elderly juror in the back row actually covered her mouth, her eyes wide with astonishment. Judge looked down at Emma, and his expression had shifted to something approaching awe mixed with deep compassion. This 9-year-old girl had somehow managed to do what traditional legal procedures might never accomplish. She'd provided nonverbal testimony through her animal companion, that seemed to cut through all the psychological games and legal maneuvering. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," Judge announced, bringing his gavel down with authority. "All parties remain present. We will reconvene to discuss what just occurred." As the courtroom cleared, Thomas sat rigidly in his chair, all color drained from his face, his hands trembling. His attorney leaned over, attempting to strategize, but Thomas appeared almost catatonic, trapped in whatever recognition had just passed between him and the dog. Emma reached down and stroked Max's head, and the dog leaned into her touch, his earlier aggression transforming back into the gentle companion she'd always known. Judge descended from the bench and approached them both, his expression conveying something between wonder and profound respect. Something extraordinary had just transpired in courtroom 7B, something that would echo through legal history and fundamentally challenge conventional understanding of evidence, testimony, and the remarkable bonds that could exist between humans and animals. Judge stood before Emma and Max in the recess area, adjacent to courtroom 7B, his judicial robe seeming to emphasize his authority, even as his expression conveyed something far more personal and human. His mind was processing information at lightning speed, connecting dots that most observers in that courtroom had yet to fully comprehend. In his 28 years on the bench, he had never witnessed anything quite like what had just transpired, and he was acutely aware that what happened in the next few minutes would determine the trajectory of this entire trial. The judge was not a man given to emotional displays or impulsive decisions. He had earned his reputation through careful deliberation, meticulous attention to legal precedent, and an almost preternatural ability to cut through deception to perceive underlying truth. But as he looked at this small girl and her remarkable dog, something within him shifted, a recognition that extended beyond legal procedure into the realm of something more fundamental and profound. "Emma," Judge began, his voice carrying a gentleness that contradicted his official bearing, "I need to understand what just happened in my courtroom. Can you explain to me what you and Max were doing?" Emma glanced up at the judge, her expression vulnerable but also strangely composed. Doctor, who had been observing from the gallery, moved forward with the judge's permission, positioning herself protectively near Emma. "Your Honor," Doctor interjected professionally, "Emma has significant trauma. She developed a communication system with Max as part of her healing process. It wasn't formal training in the traditional sense, but rather an intuitive bonding that—" Judge raised his hand gently. "I appreciate your clinical perspective, Doctor, but I'd like to hear from Emma herself. Emma, did you teach Max to respond to that specific signal, the hand gesture and the whisper?" Emma nodded slowly. "After Mommy disappeared, I was really scared. Max was the only one who understood how scared I was. I started telling him about that night, about the man's voice, about how mean and angry he sounded. I taught Max to remember." She paused, her young face serious beyond her years. "I whispered the sound of his voice to Max over and over. I taught him what that man smells like. I described it to him so many times. And I made the hand signal so Max would know when I wanted him to listen, when I wanted him to remember." Judge's expression grew increasingly contemplative. He moved to a nearby chair and sat down, deliberately lowering himself to eye level with Emma. This gesture was not lost on the observing attorneys who had gathered in the recess area. The judge was showing respect, acknowledging this child's agency and intelligence. "Emma," he said carefully, "did you specifically teach Max to react negatively to Thomas?" "No," Emma replied, her honesty evident. "I taught Max to remember what that man was like, his voice, his presence, how he made me feel. I whispered to Max everything I remembered about him, how scared he made me, how angry and dangerous he seemed. When I made the signal today, I was asking Max to remember. I was asking him to tell everyone what he knows." Doctor added, "Your Honor, from a psychological perspective, dogs possess extraordinary abilities to sense human emotions and to recognize individuals through various sensory cues." Emma didn't need to explicitly train Max to be aggressive toward this particular man. She essentially provided the dog with comprehensive sensory information about a traumatic event and the individual associated with it. When confronted with that individual in the courtroom, Max's response was instinctive. He recognized the threat Emma had imprinted upon him through their communication. Judge stood again, moving to the window overlooking downtown Chicago. His mind was working through the legal and ethical implications of what he'd witnessed. He'd studied animal behavior extensively. It was a passion that had developed over decades of reading and personal research. He understood the science. Dogs possessed an olfactory sense approximately 10,000 to 100,000 times more sensitive than humans. They could recognize individual humans through scent alone. They could perceive emotional states through pheromones and behavioral cues. They possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify threats, particularly when those threats were associated with individuals they loved. What Emma had essentially done was create a bridge between her fragmented traumatic memories and the dog's extraordinary sensory capabilities. She told Max a story, the story of the night her mother was taken. She described the perpetrator in every way her young mind could comprehend and articulate. And Max, with his remarkable cognitive abilities and his deep bond with Emma, had internalized that information and acted upon it when confronted with the object of Emma's trauma. The judge turned back to face Emma, his expression revealing the profound realization that had crystallized in his mind. "Emma," he said slowly, "do you understand what you did in that courtroom?" "I wanted everyone to know the truth," Emma replied simply. "Max knows the truth. He was there that night with me. He remembers what happened. He remembers that man." Judge felt something profound shift within him, a recognition that transcended conventional legal procedure. In his decades on the bench, he had presided over cases where human testimony conflicted, where witnesses lied under oath, where juries struggled to determine truth from fabrication. But what he just witnessed was something different entirely. He'd witnessed a truth that existed beyond language, beyond legal manipulation, beyond the psychological games that attorneys played. Max's aggression toward Thomas hadn't been trained in the conventional sense. It had emerged from the dog's recognition of danger, from his protective instinct toward the child he loved, from his ability to perceive something fundamental about the man who had caused Emma such trauma. There was no defense attorney clever enough to argue that a dog would spontaneously become aggressive toward an innocent man. There was no legal maneuver that could explain away the terror that had seized Thomas's face. Judge made his way back to his chambers, his mind crystallizing around a decision that would shape the remainder of this trial. He understood now why he'd made the unusual decision to allow Max in the courtroom. Some part of his subconscious had recognized that this case required something beyond traditional legal procedure. This was a case about truth existing at a level that transcended words, evidence, and legal argument. As he settled into his chair, Judge reflected on the years he'd spent studying animal behavior, the books he'd read about canine cognition, the documentaries he'd watched about working dogs, the personal experiences he'd had with his own German Shepherd over the decades. He'd always recognized something profound in the human-animal bond, something that seemed to access truth in ways that conventional communication could not. He pulled up research on his computer, studies about trauma responses in children, canine behavior and threat recognition, the neurobiological basis of animal-assisted therapy. The more he researched, the more evident it became that what Emma and Max had created together was a sophisticated, intuitive system of communication and truth-telling that deserved serious consideration within the legal framework. Judge understood that Thomas's reaction had been instinctive, primal, and devastatingly revealing. A guilty man confronted with truth, even truth conveyed through a dog, would respond differently than an innocent man. The dog hadn't lied. The dog couldn't lie. The dog had simply responded to the information Emma had given him combined with his extraordinary sensory perception. As the judge reviewed his notes and prepared to reconvene the courtroom, he made a decision that would have profound implications. He would allow the jury to see the recording of Max's behavior, and he would permit expert testimony regarding canine sensory capabilities and animal-assisted communication. He would treat Emma's bond with Max not as an emotional indulgence or legal irregularity, but as a legitimate form of testimony deserving serious consideration. In that frozen moment of realization, Judge understood that sometimes justice finds us not in the words we speak, but in the truths that exist beyond language, truths that animals, unburdened by human deception, could perceive and communicate with absolute authenticity. When Judge reconvened the courtroom after the 15-minute recess, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse corridors, through whispered conversations among courthouse staff, through journalists who'd been present, through the grapevine of legal professionals who frequented these halls. Everyone understood that something extraordinary had occurred, something that transcended conventional trial procedure. The gallery was now packed even more densely than before, with additional observers having arrived during the recess, sensing that history was being made. Thomas sat rigidly at the defense table, his earlier confidence completely obliterated. He no longer made eye contact with anyone. His expensive attorney, Robert, whispered urgently to him, but Thomas appeared almost catatonic, his eyes fixed on some distant point of internal torment. The transformation was so dramatic that several jurors exchanged meaningful glances. Innocent men didn't typically appear this devastated when a dog reacted negatively to them. Judge settled into his elevated chair and surveyed the courtroom with the measured authority of someone who had just made a pivotal decision. "The record will reflect that we have reviewed video recording of the previous incident," he announced formally. "The court finds this recording admissible as evidence of the defendant's reaction to the witness's animal companion. We will also permit expert testimony regarding canine behavior and sensory capabilities. Mr. Torres, you may proceed with your questioning." Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres stood, and his expression revealed controlled satisfaction. He had witnessed the same miracle that Judge had perceived. He understood that the legal landscape of this trial had fundamentally shifted. He approached the witness stand where Emma sat, with Max positioned protectively beside her, the dog's previous aggression completely transformed back into gentle companionship. "Emma," Torres began, his voice carrying renewed energy and purpose, "let me ask you directly. Did you teach Max to recognize the man who took your mother?" "Yes," Emma replied firmly, her voice stronger now, empowered by the judge's validation of her unusual communication system. "Max was with me that night. He heard that man's voice. He felt how scared I was. Over the past 2 years, I told Max everything I could remember about that man, his voice, how angry he sounded, how dangerous he felt. I wanted Max to remember so he could help me tell everyone." "And what happened when you gave Max that signal today?" Torres asked. "I asked him to remember," Emma explained simply. "I made the hand signal and whispered the things I'd taught him about that man. I asked Max to tell everyone in the courtroom what he remembers." Torres nodded, then moved toward a table where physical evidence had been arranged. He held up a series of photographs taken from the storage unit where Sarah's belongings had been discovered. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to present evidence that was discovered just 72 hours before this trial began," Torres announced. "Evidence that corroborates Emma's testimony and establishes the connection between the defendant and the disappearance of Sarah Mitchell." He displayed photographs of Sarah's personal items, her distinctive diamond-studded watch, her wedding ring, her favorite leather jacket, her identification documents. Each item was a piece of her life, preserved like trophies in a storage unit rented under an assumed name. Detective, who had worked the case relentlessly, stood to provide testimony about the discovery. "We executed a search warrant on storage unit 247 at the storage facility, which had been rented by Thomas under the false name Richard Marshall approximately 3 years ago," the detective explained. "Inside that unit, we discovered personal belongings belonging to Sarah Mitchell, as well as evidence from 2 other missing persons cases from previous years. The defendant appears to have maintained detailed records of his crimes, a practice not uncommon among perpetrators of this nature. The detective's testimony was clinical and precise, but the implications were devastating. Thomas hadn't simply abducted Sarah Mitchell. He had kept her belongings, preserved them, retained them as mementos of his crime. He was a serial predator, a man who had successfully evaded justice twice before and believed he could do so again. Judge leaned forward, his expression grave. He understood the legal implications of what was emerging. A storage unit containing a victim's personal effects was powerful circumstantial evidence. Combined with Emma's testimony, and most significantly, Max's instinctive recognition of the perpetrator, the prosecution was building an airtight case. Robert stood to cross-examine Detective, but his questions were now defensive rather than offensive. He attempted to suggest that the storage unit might have been rented by someone else, that the personal effects could have been placed there by an unknown third party, but the detective's responses were methodical and comprehensive. The rental agreement bore Thomas's fingerprints. The handwriting on the storage unit documentation matched samples already on file from previous arrests. Torres then presented forensic evidence, DNA analysis confirming that Sarah Mitchell's hair had been found in Thomas's vehicle, fibers from her clothing discovered on his clothing during his arrest, a detailed timeline showing his movements in the hours surrounding her disappearance, all traceable through his cell phone data, credit card usage, and eyewitness accounts. But what struck the jury most profoundly was not the forensic evidence or the detective's testimony. It was the memory of Max's behavior. It was the undeniable reaction of a creature incapable of deception, incapable of being coached to react falsely, responding with instinctive aggression and protective fury to the man who had caused Emma such catastrophic trauma. One juror, a middle-aged woman with piercing blue eyes, watched Thomas intently during the testimony. She could see the slight tremor in his hands, the way his jaw clenched, the absolute terror that flickered across his features when particularly damning evidence was presented. This was not the appearance of an innocent man trapped by circumstantial evidence. This was the appearance of a guilty man watching his carefully constructed defense collapse into rubble. Judge made copious notes throughout the testimony, occasionally glancing toward Emma with an expression that mingled profound respect with deep compassion. He recognized that this 9-year-old girl, through her innovative communication with her dog, had essentially accomplished what countless law enforcement professionals might never have achieved. She had identified her mother's abductor with certainty. She had provided corroborating testimony that now connected to physical evidence. She had, through her bond with Max, conveyed truth that transcended the limitations of her traumatized child's memory. When Torres concluded his questions and declined to cross-examine further, a strategic decision to avoid prolonging Emma's testimony and further highlighting the credibility issues that now plagued the defense, Judge made a brief announcement. This court recognizes that extraordinary circumstances have presented themselves in this trial, he stated formally. The evidence presented today, both the traditional forensic evidence and the behavioral evidence provided by the witness's animal companion, has substantially altered the evidentiary landscape. We will reconvene tomorrow morning to hear closing arguments. As Emma was escorted from the witness stand, several jurors were visibly emotional. One elderly man in the back row actually wiped tears from his eyes. They had just witnessed something remarkable, a child's profound bond with her dog transcending conventional testimony to reveal fundamental truth. They had seen a dog respond not to training or manipulation, but to genuine recognition of a threat to someone he loved. Thomas's attorney approached him, attempting to formulate some kind of defense strategy, but Thomas barely seemed to hear him. His eyes remained fixed on Emma as she left the courtroom, on Max as the dog walked beside her. In that moment, Thomas understood the magnitude of his predicament. He had underestimated a 9-year-old girl and her dog. He had believed himself clever enough to evade justice once again, but he had not anticipated this. Judge remained on the bench long after the courtroom had emptied, reflecting on what he'd witnessed. In his decades of legal service, he had never encountered a case where justice had emerged so vividly through the intersection of human love, animal instinct, and technological evidence. Emma's bond with Max had revealed something profound about truth itself, that it existed at levels beyond language, beyond conventional testimony, accessible through the extraordinary connections that formed between humans and the animals they cherished. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows as attorneys prepared their closing arguments. The atmosphere in courtroom 7B crackled with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, with additional observers standing along the walls. Journalists clutched their cameras and notepads, sensing that the conclusion of this extraordinary trial was imminent. Judge entered with his characteristic measured pace, but his expression revealed the gravity with which he regarded the proceedings about to unfold. Robert stood first, his earlier confidence completely dismantled by the events of the previous day. Even the most skilled defense attorney cannot overcome the combined weight of forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the irrefutable nonverbal communication of a traumatized child's protective dog. His closing argument was defensive, almost perfunctory. He attempted to attack the reliability of Emma's memory, to suggest that the storage unit could have been planted there by someone else, to argue that circumstantial evidence remained circumstantial regardless of how compelling it appeared. "Ladies and of the jury," began, his voice lacking its earlier precision and authority, "what you have witnessed in this courtroom are the tools of emotional manipulation. A sympathetic child, a loyal dog, forensic evidence that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution has presented circumstantial evidence and emotional testimony, but has it truly proven beyond a reasonable doubt that my client is guilty of the charges against him?" His argument continued in this vein for nearly an hour, but the jurors' expressions remained unchanged, unconvinced and increasingly hostile to his implications. Several jurors actually shook their heads at various points in his argument. One older juror, a retired mathematics teacher, stared directly at Thomas with an expression of undisguised contempt. The defense was not merely weak. It was insulting to the intelligence of jurors who had observed the totality of evidence. When Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres stood for the prosecution's closing argument, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his case was unassailable. He approached the jury box deliberately, making eye contact with each juror individually. "Ladies and," Torres began, his voice resonant and measured, "what you have witnessed is not just a trial. You have witnessed an extraordinary display of truth-telling that transcends conventional legal procedure. You have heard testimony from a traumatized child whose memory, though fragmented, has been corroborated by physical evidence at every possible point. You have witnessed the behavioral response of a dog, an animal incapable of deception, incapable of being coached to react falsely, recognize the perpetrator of a heinous crime." Torres methodically reviewed every piece of evidence: the storage unit containing Sarah Mitchell's personal effects, the DNA evidence placing her in Thomas's vehicle, the cell phone data establishing his presence near the abduction site, the fingerprint evidence, the fiber analysis, the eyewitness accounts. But more significantly, he contextualized this evidence within the larger narrative of what Emma and Max had revealed. The defendant believed he could escape justice through legal maneuvering, Torres explained. He believed he could silence a child through intimidation and trauma. He believed he could hide behind expensive lawyers and clever arguments. But he did not anticipate that a 9-year-old girl and her dog would possess the clarity of mind and the courage to tell the truth in a way that transcends every defense mechanism he could deploy. Torres paused, allowing his words to settle over the jury. Sarah Mitchell is still missing. Her family remains devastated. But thanks to this child's extraordinary courage and her bond with her animal companion, we now have irrefutable evidence of what happened to her. The defendant took a mother from her daughter. He violated every principle of human decency and legal authority. And now, the law demands accountability. The prosecution's closing argument was approximately 90 minutes of methodical, comprehensive legal reasoning, combined with emotional resonance that neither manipulated nor overwhelmed. It simply presented truth in its most undeniable form. Judge instructed the jury with careful precision regarding the legal standards they must apply, but his instructions also acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the evidence they had considered. You may give whatever weight you deem appropriate to the behavioral response of the witness's animal companion, he stated carefully. The law recognizes that evidence can take many forms, and truth can be communicated through various means. The question before you is not whether this evidence is conventional, but whether it is probative, whether it helps establish the facts of the case. The jury retired to deliberation at 2:47 p.m. Judge returned to his chambers, where he reflected on the complexity of what had transpired. In his decades on the bench, he had observed the evolution of evidence standards, the introduction of DNA analysis, the acceptance of increasingly sophisticated forensic techniques. But he had never encountered a situation where animal behavior had been presented as central evidence in a capital crime. In the deliberation room, the jury's discussion was remarkably brief. The jurors' first vote was 11-1 for conviction, with only one juror expressing residual doubt about the interpretation of Max's behavior. But as his colleagues methodically reviewed the forensic evidence, the DNA analysis, the cell phone records, and the storage unit contents, even this holdout conceded. By the third vote, the decision was unanimous, guilty on all charges. What neither the jury nor judge anticipated was what occurred during the recess before the verdict was announced. Thomas sat in a holding cell, his psychological collapse accelerating by the hour. The sight of Emma and Max, the undeniable recognition from a creature he couldn't deceive or manipulate, had fractured something fundamental within him. He had spent decades cultivating an image of control, of superiority, of immunity from consequences. But a 9-year-old girl and her dog had shattered that carefully constructed facade. His attorney entered the holding area with legal papers, discussing potential appeals and sentencing mitigation strategies. But Thomas interrupted him with a statement that would alter the trajectory of the case forever. "I want to confess," Thomas said quietly, his voice stripped of all bravado and confidence. "I want to tell the court everything." His attorney's expression transformed to one of professional concern. "That is not advisable. We should wait for the verdict and then discuss sentencing strategies." "No," Thomas said, his voice carrying a strange combination of despair and almost relieved finality. "That girl and her dog, they saw the truth. I can't fight that. I don't want to fight that anymore." When court reconvened, Judge was informed of Thomas's desire to make a statement before the verdict was announced. The judge, recognizing the unusual but not unprecedented nature of such a request, permitted it. Thomas was brought before the bench, and his earlier composure was completely absent. He appeared diminished, broken, hollowed out. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice barely audible, "I wish to withdraw my not guilty plea and enter a guilty plea to all charges. I wish to make a full confession." The courtroom erupted. Journalists scrambled to document this extraordinary turn of events. Judge banged his gavel for order, his expression revealing his understanding of what had just occurred. "Mr. Thomas," the judge stated carefully, "do you understand that this confession means you are relinquishing your right to trial, that you are admitting to the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied. "I want to tell them where she is. I want her family to know." Over the next hour, Thomas provided a detailed confession regarding his crimes spanning nearly 15 years. He detailed 3 separate abductions, including Sarah Mitchell's. He described the location where he'd imprisoned her for several months before moving her to an abandoned warehouse 30 miles outside Chicago. His detailed knowledge of locations, dates, and circumstances could only have come from direct perpetration of these crimes. Most remarkably, as Thomas provided these details, his eyes repeatedly turned toward Emma, who sat in the gallery between her aunt and doctor. It was as if he was acknowledging that this child and her dog had achieved what no conventional legal procedure could accomplish. They had forced him to confront the reality of his actions, to abandon his pretense of innocence, to accept accountability. Judge listened to the complete confession, then ordered immediate search operations to the location Thomas had identified. He instructed the bailiff, "Bring the child and her dog forward." Emma and Max approached the bench, and Judge looked down at them with profound respect. "Emma, your courage and your bond with Max have accomplished something extraordinary today. You have not only identified your mother's abductor, but you have compelled him to reveal the locations of other victims. Your testimony, in its most essential form, has served justice in ways that transcend conventional legal procedure." The verdict was rendered, guilty on all charges. But more importantly, the confession had provided hope that Sarah Mitchell and potentially other victims might still be alive. The search and rescue operation began immediately following Thomas's confession. Judge had suspended all normal court procedures, and law enforcement agencies mobilized with urgent precision. The abandoned warehouse that Thomas had identified was located in an industrial district 30 miles south of Chicago, a desolate structure that had been condemned for structural damage years earlier. Nobody had any realistic expectation that Sarah Mitchell could still be alive after 3 years of captivity, but the confession had provided something more valuable than hope. It had provided a specific location and the promise of closure. Detective James coordinated the search personally, leading a team of forensic specialists, rescue workers, and uniformed officers into the decaying structure. The warehouse was a maze of deteriorating corridors, collapsed sections, and areas hazardous enough to require specialized equipment. As they navigated deeper into the building, following Thomas's detailed directions, they discovered chambers that appeared to have been deliberately concealed, areas where a prisoner could be held with minimal risk of discovery. In the third concealed area they searched, they found her. Sarah Mitchell was alive, severely malnourished, traumatized, and physically compromised by 3 years of imprisonment, but alive. She was curled in a corner of a makeshift room, surrounded by remnants of her captivity. A mattress, water bottles, basic sanitation facilities, and most tellingly, a calendar on which she had been marking the passage of time with scratched lines on the wall. She had survived through sheer force of will, clinging to the belief that her daughter might someday remember her, might somehow find her. When the rescue team entered, Sarah initially recoiled in terror, her mind fragmented by years of isolation and trauma. But when the team identified themselves, when they explained that her daughter Emma had provided the information that led them to her, something awakened in Sarah's traumatized consciousness. She wept uncontrollably, tears that had been impossible during 3 years of captivity when survival required emotional suppression. The rescue was broadcast live on national news networks. Within hours, the story had reached every major news outlet in the United States. A 9-year-old girl and her dog had not only identified a serial perpetrator, they had resulted in the discovery of a missing woman presumed dead, a woman who had miraculously survived 3 years of captivity through extraordinary resilience. Emma watched the news coverage from her aunt's living room, her eyes fixed on the screen as rescue workers carefully escorted a fragile, barely recognizable woman from the warehouse. The woman was her mother, older, diminished by her ordeal, but unmistakably Sarah Mitchell. Emma's hand instinctively moved to Max's head, stroking his fur as tears streamed down her face. "That's Mommy," she whispered to the dog. "Max, we found Mommy." The dog, sensing Emma's emotional upheaval, pressed closer to her, his protective presence a tangible reminder of the extraordinary bond that had made this miracle possible. Sarah Mitchell was transported to Memorial Hospital, where she underwent comprehensive medical evaluation. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from numerous infections. Her physical condition reflected the brutality of her captivity, but her mental resilience was perhaps even more remarkable. She had survived not through accident or luck, but through the deliberate maintenance of psychological stability in circumstances designed to destroy it. When Sarah was stable enough for visitors, the first person she requested was Emma. The reunion occurred in Sarah's hospital room, a moment that would be replayed on news networks internationally and discussed in psychology departments for years to come. Emma entered hesitantly, uncertain whether this woman, who bore only a passing resemblance to her fragmented childhood memories, was truly her mother. Sarah, despite her weakened state, sat up, and mother and daughter locked eyes across the space of 3 years. "Emma," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse, "my baby girl, you're so big now." Emma rushed forward, and they embraced with the desperate intensity of two people separated by nightmare circumstances, finally reunited. Sarah wept, her entire body shaking with the release of 3 years of accumulated trauma, fear, and longing. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, feeling the reality of Sarah's presence in a way that no news report could convey. "I knew you'd find me," Sarah said through her tears. "I knew you wouldn't forget me. I knew my baby would remember." Max remained at the doorway, his presence a tangible reminder of the connection that had made this reunion possible. When Sarah noticed the dog, she reached toward him with a trembling hand. "This is Max?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying wonder and gratitude. "This is the dog who helped you find me." Emma nodded, bringing Max into their embrace. The dog, sensing the profound emotional significance of this moment, was unusually gentle, as if he understood that Sarah needed comfort as desperately as Emma had needed his protective presence. Judge visited the hospital personally, a gesture that transcended his judicial role. He stood outside Sarah's room, observing the reunion through a window, his expression revealing the profound emotion that transcended his professional demeanor. When he entered the room, Sarah looked up with gratitude so profound it seemed to physically affect her. "Your Honor," Sarah said, attempting to sit up despite her weakened condition, "I don't have words to express what this girl and her dog have given back to me. I had lost hope that anyone would ever find me. And then my daughter and an animal companion accomplished what seemed impossible." Judge approached her bedside with genuine warmth. "Sarah, your daughter has displayed extraordinary courage and resilience. What she and Max have accomplished extends far beyond this courtroom. They have changed how we understand testimony, how we recognize truth, and how we honor the bonds between humans and animals." The judge turned to Emma, and his expression carried profound respect. "Emma, I want you to know that Thomas will face sentencing for multiple felonies, including kidnapping, illegal imprisonment, and assault. He will spend the remainder of his life in prison. Your testimony, combined with your bond with Max, has ensured that he will never harm another person. You have served justice in ways that extend far beyond what most adults accomplish in their entire lives." As news of Sarah's miraculous survival spread, the story became an international phenomenon. Media outlets described it as the girl who solved a crime with her dog. Psychology departments requested permissions to study Emma's case. Animal behaviorists conducted extensive interviews examining the extraordinary communication system she and Max had developed. Universities invited Judge to lecture about the legal implications of animal-assisted testimony. But amid all the media attention and professional interest, the most important development was the reconstruction of Emma and Sarah's family. Sarah remained hospitalized for 3 weeks, undergoing physical rehabilitation and psychological counseling. During that time, Emma visited daily, and the two of them began the long process of rebuilding their relationship and processing the trauma they had endured. Emma's father, Michael, who had relocated to Colorado years earlier, returned to Chicago. He visited his ex-wife and daughter, and for the first time in 3 years, family unity seemed possible, fractured and fragile but genuine. They made plans for Sarah's recovery, for Emma's continued therapy, and for the family to eventually reunite in a formal capacity. Thomas received a life sentence without possibility of parole. His plea agreement required him to provide information about additional victims from his decades of criminal activity. 4 women were ultimately identified as having been victimized by him, and 3 of them were located alive, their rescue directly resulting from his confession to Emma and Max. Judge delivered the sentencing personally. Thomas, you have committed heinous crimes spanning nearly 2 decades. You have destroyed families, traumatized victims, and violated every principle of human decency. The sentence of this court is that you will spend the remainder of your natural life in incarceration. You will never again have the opportunity to harm another human being. This sentence is final. As Thomas was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, he made eye contact with Emma one final time. His expression carried a mixture of resignation and profound regret, the acknowledgement of a guilty man who understood that a 9-year-old girl and her dog had revealed truths he could never conceal or deny. Emma sat beside Max, her small hand stroking his golden fur, feeling the pride and love that had driven her through the most difficult challenge of her young life. She had solved a crime. She had saved her mother's life. She had revealed truth in ways that would revolutionize how justice was understood and pursued. But most importantly, she had honored the extraordinary bond between human and animal that transcended conventional understanding and revealed something profoundly real about the nature of love, loyalty, and the pursuit of justice. 6 months after Thomas's sentencing, Emma stood on the stage of Chicago's Convention Center alongside her mother, Sarah, their hands intertwined as hundreds of journalists, animal behaviorists, legal professionals, and victims' advocates filled the auditorium. Max sat beside them, his golden fur gleaming under the bright stage lights, completely at ease in the presence of so many people. What had begun as a personal tragedy had evolved into a movement that would fundamentally transform how justice was pursued in courtrooms across America. Judge sat in the front row, his expression revealing the profound satisfaction of witnessing the culmination of the case he'd helped navigate. Beside him sat Doctor, the child psychologist whose clinical insights had helped Emma develop her extraordinary communication system with Max. Behind them sat Detective James, whose relentless investigation had provided the forensic evidence that corroborated Emma's testimony. This gathering represented not merely the conclusion of a trial, but the beginning of something far more significant, a revolution in how the legal system understood and incorporated evidence that transcended conventional testimony. The moderator, a renowned legal analyst from a major network, began the discussion. Emma, when you taught Max to help you communicate about that night, did you ever imagine that your bond with him would change the legal system? Emma, now 10 years old and carrying herself with a maturity beyond her years, responded thoughtfully. I just wanted someone to understand what I remembered. Max understood, and I knew that if I could help Max understand, then maybe grown-ups would believe me too. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes reflecting the profound gratitude and ongoing recovery that characterized her life since rescue. What Emma accomplished with Max is remarkable, but I also want to acknowledge the incredible work of law enforcement, the prosecutors, and judge who recognized the extraordinary nature of this evidence and allowed it to be presented. Judge was then invited to share his perspective. He approached the podium with the measured authority that had defined his judicial career, but his words carried an emotional depth that revealed the personal impact this case had exerted upon him. In my 28 years on the bench, I have witnessed the evolution of evidence standards repeatedly, Judge began. We have accepted DNA analysis. We have incorporated digital forensics. We have adapted to new technologies that reveal truth. But what this case has taught me is that sometimes truth exists beyond our conventional categories. Sometimes an animal, unburdened by human deception and motivated purely by love and protection, can perceive and communicate reality in ways that transcend language and legal procedure. He paused, looking directly at Emma and Max. This child and her dog did not merely solve a crime. They demonstrated that justice can be served through connections that exist at fundamental levels of being. They revealed that love, in its form, is an instrument of truth. Judge then announced a proposal that had been developing over the past months: the establishment of the Mitchell-Richardson Protocol, a set of legal guidelines that would permit animal-assisted testimony in appropriate circumstances, with proper expert validation and careful judicial oversight. This protocol would allow other traumatized children, other victims of crime, to utilize their bonds with trained animals to communicate about their experiences. The protocol included comprehensive standards. Animals would need to be evaluated by certified animal behaviorists. Testimony incorporating animal evidence would require expert testimony explaining the animal's capabilities. Judges would retain discretion regarding admissibility, and the animal's behavior would be considered corroborative evidence rather than primary testimony. It was a careful, legally rigorous approach to incorporating what Emma and Max had demonstrated into the broader framework of American jurisprudence. Universities across the nation began establishing research centers devoted to studying the intersection of animal cognition, trauma communication, and legal testimony. The University of Chicago created the Emma Richardson Center for Animal-Assisted Justice, recruiting leading researchers in animal behavior, psychology, and legal studies. Emma herself became a subject of extensive academic study, not as a curiosity, but as a window into the extraordinary capabilities that could emerge from the bond between traumatized children and their protective animals. Doctor published a groundbreaking paper titled Intuitive Communication Systems in Trauma Recovery, the Emma Richardson Case Study, which became required reading in psychology departments nationwide. Her work documented not merely the behavioral aspects of Emma's communication with Max, but the psychological mechanisms through which trauma could be processed and articulated through nonverbal, animal-mediated communication. Sarah's recovery progressed gradually but steadily. She underwent extensive physical rehabilitation, addressing the nutritional deficiencies and muscular degeneration resulting from 3 years of captivity. But her psychological recovery proved even more challenging. She worked with specialized trauma therapists who helped her process the horror of her imprisonment while simultaneously celebrating the miracle of her rescue. Slowly, deliberately, Sarah rebuilt her life, returning to work on a modified schedule, reconnecting with extended family, and most importantly, reconstructing her relationship with her daughter. Emma and Sarah attended family counseling sessions where they processed their separate but interconnected traumas. Emma had suffered the trauma of witnessing her mother's abduction and then living for 3 years without knowing whether her mother was alive or dead. Sarah had endured 3 years of captivity, yet their bond, which had never been completely severed despite their separation, became the foundation upon which they rebuilt their family. Michael Richardson, Emma's father, moved back to Chicago permanently. Though his marriage to Sarah could not be salvaged, the trauma had fundamentally altered their relationship. He and Sarah developed a respectful co-parenting arrangement. They recognized that their primary obligation was to Emma's and healing. Michael returned to his career and established a household where Emma could spend time with him. Most importantly, Max remained central to Emma's life, accompanying her between her mother's home and her father's apartment. As Emma entered middle school, she became something of a minor celebrity. She was invited to speak at schools, to participate in legal conferences, to contribute her perspective to documentary films about the case. Emma handled this attention with remarkable grace, understanding that her story could inspire other children to speak up about abuse and trauma they had experienced. 1 year after Sarah's rescue, the Emma Richardson Foundation was established, dedicated to supporting trauma survivors, funding animal-assisted therapy programs, and advocating for legal reforms that would incorporate animal-assisted evidence in appropriate circumstances. The foundation received contributions from individuals worldwide, from legal organizations, from animal welfare groups, and from victims' advocacy networks. Emma became the youngest board member of a major charitable foundation, though she continued attending school and maintaining a normal childhood to the greatest extent possible. Judge authored a comprehensive legal treatise titled Justice Beyond Words: The Evolution of Evidence in the 21st Century, which examined the philosophical and practical implications of animal-assisted testimony. His work became influential in legal circles, cited in law school classes, and referenced in subsequent court decisions, establishing precedent for animal-assisted evidence. The Mitchell-Richardson Protocol was adopted by multiple state courts, and within 18 months, 3 additional cases had successfully incorporated animal-assisted testimony in their proceedings. In each case, traumatized children working with trained animals had provided corroborating evidence that helped convict perpetrators of serious crimes. The protocol had proven effective not merely as an emotional support mechanism, but as a legitimate investigative tool that revealed truth in ways conventional testimony could not. 2 years after Thomas's sentencing, a documentary titled The Girl Who Spoke Through Her Dog premiered at major film festivals worldwide. It told the story of Emma, Max, Sarah, and the extraordinary legal precedent they had established. The documentary was nominated for numerous awards and viewed by millions, bringing international attention to the case and inspiring similar initiatives in other countries. Emma received recognition from numerous organizations. The American Bar Association recognized her as an extraordinary contributor to legal innovation. Animal welfare organizations honored Max as a hero. Trauma counselors celebrated her courage and resilience. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the survivors Thomas had victimized, the 4 women he had abducted. They publicly acknowledged that Emma's actions had resulted in their rescue, had given them opportunities for healing they had thought forever lost. By age 12, Emma had already impacted the legal system in ways that most lawyers never accomplish. She had changed how trauma was conceptualized in courtrooms. She had demonstrated that justice could emerge from unexpected sources. She had honored her bond with Max by transforming personal tragedy into systemic change. Sarah, now fully recovered and employed as a victim's advocate with a legal nonprofit organization, dedicated her professional life to supporting other trauma survivors. She worked with Emma, appearing together at events and speaking about recovery and resilience. Their mother-daughter bond, fractured by Thomas's cruelty but never completely severed, emerged stronger from their shared ordeal. And Max, the golden retriever who had been a puppy on the night Sarah disappeared, became recognized internationally as a symbol of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, of the possibility that love could transcend trauma, and that sometimes the pursuit of justice finds us in the most unexpected ways. The courtroom where Emma had made her historic testimony was designated as a historic site. Law students visited it to study the case. It became a monument to the proposition that truth, pursued with courage and honesty, ultimately prevails, even when that truth is revealed through a girl and her dog, communicating in a language that existed beyond words, accessible only through the profound connection that binds them together eternally.